The fluorescent lights hummed like a swarm of insects frozen mid-flight. Rachel Torres pushed the suture cart down the hallway of St. Michael's ER at 2:17 a.m., her movements too efficient, too practiced, each step a muscle memory older than her nursing license. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and old coffee and something underneath, copper, maybe, or the particular staleness that comes from thousands of hours under artificial light. Her badge clipped to her scrubs read Rachel Torres, temporary RN. 3 words that felt like a sentence. The emergency department at St. Michael's in Raleigh operated on a rhythm that most people never heard. The squeaking of stretcher wheels against tile. The hiss of oxygen masks. The electronic chirp of 4 pumps counting down medication in milliliters per minute. At night, the sound seemed louder, as if the building itself was more alert when the sun disappeared. Rachel moved through it like water moving around rocks, necessary, unremarkable, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. She was paying attention to everything. The patient in Bay 3 whose respiratory rate had drifted from 18 to 22 over the last 4 hours. The elderly man in Bay 7 whose pupils had reacted a half-second too slowly to the penlight. The child in the waiting area who kept favoring her left arm even when she thought no one was looking. Rachel had seen what happened when people stopped paying attention in rooms where people stopped breathing. Her hands moved through the restocking with precision that took years to earn. Suture trays arranged by size. Sterile gauze squares stacked in towers. The 14-gauge angiocath needles organized by color code. She wore long sleeves despite the heat of the ER. The hospital kept the temperature at a consistent 71 degrees, but heat always seemed to find her anyway. The sleeves covered scars that ran from her left wrist to her elbow, a topographical map of places where flesh had separated from intention. She didn't think about them anymore. Or she thought about them constantly. It was hard to tell the difference. The dog tag caught the light as she reached across the supply shelf, the chain hanging half an inch below her collarbone where her scrubs gaped open. One name. Not her name. The metal was tarnished silver, the edges worn smooth from a decade of someone else's hands around someone else's neck. She felt the weight of it every shift, a small anchor pulling down toward her heart. Rachel's fingers found it before her conscious mind registered the movement, tucking it back beneath her scrubs in one motion that looked almost like scratching an itch. The reflexive gesture took less than a second. She was careful about seconds. Dr. Gabriel watched her from the physician station, his eyes tracking her movements across the ER floor like a predator cataloging prey. He stood with both hands on the counter, his white coat tailored in a way that suggested money and the kind of authority that came from having always been in the room where decisions were made. His face carried the architecture of someone who had never doubted himself, sharp cheekbones, a jawline that seemed capable of cutting glass, the assured posture of a man who had spent his entire life expecting other people to defer. He was 47 years old and had held his position as senior emergency physician at St. Michael's for 12 years, which meant he had seen temporary nurses rotate through like paper towels in a bathroom dispenser. This one was different, though. Not in ways he could articulate. She moved with a precision that felt purposeful rather than nervous. She anticipated things. When Dr. Harrison barked for a blood pressure cuff, this temp nurse, Rachel, he'd heard someone call her, had already pulled one from the wall and was unrolling it before Harrison finished the sentence. When the EKG machine in Bay 4 ran out of paper, she was there with a fresh roll. Not eager. Not trying to impress. Just present, the way people are present when they've done something 1,000 times before. Dr. Gabriel did not like people in his hospital who were more competent than they appeared. Competence was currency, and currency that wasn't accounted for was theft. He turned back to his charts, dismissing her from his attention the way you dismiss a sound you can't identify. Another rebuilding case, probably. Another nurse putting her life back together after something. They all had stories if you asked, and Gabriel never asked because he did not care about stories that didn't serve him. She wore her sadness like everyone else wore exhaustion, it was just the baseline color of people who worked nights. Rachel completed the suture tray restocking and moved toward Bay 6, where a Marine father in a faded Camp Lejeune t-shirt sat beside his 8-year-old daughter. The girl's name was Emma, according to the chart. Third visit to St. Michael's in 4 weeks. Third different diagnosis. The first doctor had called it anemia. The second had suggested mononucleosis. The third had used the word stress and prescribed sleep, as if a child could sleep her way back to health. Emma looked smaller than she had on the first visit, her skin the color of old paper, translucent in a way that made the bruises underneath more visible. The bruises were wrong. They covered her legs in patterns that didn't match a child's normal falling, too dense, too symmetrical, too much like a map of something internal breaking. Rachel approached the bedside with the chart in her hand, her face arranged in the expression of professional competence that had become her default. "Hi Emma," she said, her voice pitched to reach only the child. "How are you feeling tonight?" The girl managed a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Tired," she said. Rachel's eye stayed on the child for exactly 2 seconds too long, long enough to catalogue the skin pallor, the nail beds, the way the light moved across the surface of her eyes. Long enough to count the bruises. Long enough to see something that no one else in this emergency department had bothered to look for because they were too busy defending their own diagnoses. "When did the bruising start?" Rachel asked, turning to the father. "About 3 weeks ago," he said, his voice carrying the specific exhaustion of a parent who has explained the same thing 10 times to 10 different doctors. First doctor said he'd seen it before. Growing pains, he called it. My wife, he stopped, his jaw working. Emma's mother insisted on the follow-up. Rachel nodded and made a note in the chart without writing anything. Her hands were steady. Her breathing remained unchanged. The dog tag pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. "I'm going to check her vitals again, if that's okay," Rachel said. She wrapped the blood pressure cuff around Emma's thin arm. The thing was barely tight, almost a suggestion of pressure rather than actual measurement, and the numbers that appeared on the display told her something that should have been told to her family hours ago. The systolic was 102. In an 8-year-old, that was high. Her heart rate was 104, also elevated for rest. Rachel's fingers moved to the child's wrist anyway, counting the beats manually, feeling for the rhythm beneath the skin. Pain was information. The body was always sending signals for people who knew how to listen. Dr. Gabriel appeared at the entrance to Bay 6, his shadow crossing the linoleum like a weather pattern. He was reviewing the chart with the kind of rapid eye movement that meant he was already preparing his exit from this case, already composing his next instructions as if they were fact rather than decisions. "Likely viral," he said, not actually looking at Emma. "Rest and fluids. Follow up with pediatrics if symptoms persist." "Her vitals are elevated," Rachel said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't crack. It simply stated the fact as if the fact were obvious. BP 102 systolic, heart rate 104 at rest. That pattern with the bruising. "Bruising is common with active children," Dr. Gabriel said. His tone suggested he was explaining something to a nursing student, not consulting with another medical professional. "The slight elevation is likely from the anxiety of the hospital visit. She's anxious, you can see it in her face." Rachel was quiet for a moment. The room hummed with the fluorescent lights, with the ventilator in the bay next door, with the particular silence of someone choosing not to speak. "Of course, doctor," she said. Dr. Gabriel departed, already reaching for his phone, already moving toward his next patient, already certain. Rachel finished taking Emma's vitals and documented them in the chart with the precision of someone recording evidence, then moved back toward the supply station, where she stood for exactly 11 seconds with her hand on the counter, not moving, just standing in the particular stillness that comes from having seen something no one else has bothered to look for. Her fingers found the dog tag beneath her scrubs again, just for a moment, just enough to feel the shape of the name that was not hers. The shift continued. 3:14 a.m. A drunk driver with a lacerated forehead. 3:47 a.m. An elderly woman with chest pain, the kind that felt like pressure, she said, like someone was standing on her ribs. Rachel was there with the EKG leads before anyone asked, running the machine with the fluid efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times, not panicking, just present. The woman's heart was fine, it turned out. Anxiety. Stress. The particular weight of being 73 years old and alone in an emergency room at 3 a.m. But that wasn't the worst part of the night. At 4:23 a.m., the paramedic radio crackled with a call about a motor vehicle collision on I-40. Two cars. One flipped. ETA to St. Michael's, 6 minutes. The ER team mobilized with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this hundreds of times. Trauma bays prepared. Blood bank notified. Rachel moved with everyone else, her movements aligned with the choreography, the dance that happens when a hospital knows something broken is coming. She was in Bay 1 when the first ambulance pulled up, and she didn't know yet that her entire life was about to hinge on what happened in the next 72 hours. She didn't know that the Marine who arrived on that stretcher would be the one who took her place when she left. She didn't know what his name was, or that his leg would swell like a balloon filling with blood, or that 10 doctors would miss the warning signs of a compartment syndrome that would cost him everything if someone didn't do something impossible. She just knew the pattern in the data. She just knew the way bodies talked when you learned the language. She just knew that Emma was getting worse and no one had listened, and that meant the next time she had to push back, it would have to matter. Her hands rested on the edge of the trauma bay table, perfectly still, perfectly ready. The intercom crackled at 2,247 hours. Rachel was restocking the trauma bay when the voice cut through the fluorescent hum of the ER. Rachel the temp to Station 3. Rachel the temp. The entire floor heard it. The overhead paging system in St. Michael's carried every word to the waiting area, to the break room, to the supply closet where 2 nurses were stealing a moment of quiet. Rachel didn't pause. Her hands continued arranging 14-gauge angiocath needles in their trays with the same precision she'd used on field operations in Fallujah, same pace, same focus, same refusal to acknowledge that 23 RNS and 4 residents just heard her called the temp like it was her actual designation. She felt the glances. Pity from some of the older nurses who remembered when new staff were treated like humans. Amusement from the residents who saw Dr. Gabriel making a point. Embarrassment from the paramedics who'd started to respect her clinical instinct until the overhead announcement made it clear that respect had a ceiling. Rachel's jaw tightened. A muscle flickered once beneath the skin. She set down the last needle and walked toward Station 3. Dr. Gabriel stood there with a stack of bedpans, his smile the kind that made the air pressure change, not warm, not predatory exactly, but the smile of a man discovering he could rearrange the hierarchy with nothing but words and a hospital intercom. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with the kind of confidence that came from 12 years of never being questioned and a medical degree from Johns Hopkins that hung framed in his office like a warning label. "Since you're so eager to help patients," he said, handing her the stack, "start with the basics. These are the fundamentals of nursing. I'm sure you'll find them enlightening." Rachel took the bedpans. The plastic was cold against her palms. She didn't respond. She turned and walked back toward the patient rooms. Behind her, she heard Dr. Gabriel laugh, a sharp bark that carried to the nurse's station, and one of the younger residents actually smiled like they'd been given permission. The next 2 shifts were study in systemic pressure. Gabriel called her name over the intercom 3 more times, each one slightly different, each one public. Rachel the temp, housekeeping needs support in Bay 7. Rachel the temp, can you grab supplies from the basement? The staff stopped greeting her. The resident stopped making eye contact. By the second day, she was eating lunch alone in the parking lot with her hands shaking, not from fear, but from the effort of restraint, from holding down the muscle memory that had learned long ago that you don't absorb insults, you store them. It was 2 days later when the supply closet became a trap. Rachel was restocking full lines in the narrow storage room, the one behind the pharmacy where the ventilator machines hummed their mechanical rhythm and the smell of plastic tubing and antiseptic hung thick enough to taste. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. Dr. Gabriel blocked the doorway like he'd timed it, like he'd been waiting for her to be alone in the smallest room on the floor. "You contradict my orders again," he said, his voice dropping to the conversational volume that made it somehow worse than shouting, "You're done. I don't care what fancy techniques you think you learned at whatever community college gave you that degree." He stepped closer. Too close. Using his height like a weapon, making her tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. That was the real dominance play, forcing her to crane her neck while he loomed, forcing her into a physical posture of submission. Rachel took one measured breath through her nose. A single tear escaped her left eye. Just one. She didn't sob, didn't gasp, didn't let her lip tremble. The tear ran down her cheek like a single bullet wound, precise and unavoidable, and she wiped it away with her knuckle without breaking eye contact. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. It was different now, the voice of someone who'd given permission slips for combat operations, who'd watched Marines die because they followed orders from men less competent than her, who'd learned that fear is just information repacked as emotion. I wonder if your patients know how much of your authority depends on fear. Dr. Gabriel's face flushed crimson from his collar to his hairline. For 3 seconds, nothing in the supply closet moved except his breathing, which had gotten faster, shallower, the breathing of someone realizing that threatening the wrong person sometimes comes with a price they can't absorb. Rachel was already moving past him, her shoulder brushing his arm as she exited, leaving him standing alone among the plastic tubing and the hum of machines, understanding for the first time that he'd miscalculated something fundamental. But that wasn't the worst part. The escalation came on morning shift change. Rachel was finishing her bedpan rotation in the parking lot, the assigned location that had become its own kind of statement, visible to every arriving nurse, a daily reminder of her diminished status. The sun was still low, the November air sharp enough to cut, and the service entrance doors kept swinging open to release new staff for their 12-hour rotations. Dr. Gabriel walked out with his hand on the arm of Dr. Keisha Washington, the department head. He positioned himself where the arriving staff could see him. Where they could all see. Torres, he called, his voice carrying across the parking lot like he was addressing a jury, you're on bedpan rotation for the next 2 weeks. Maybe that'll teach you about respecting the chain of command. 20 staff members stopped walking. Some slowed down to watch. Others pretended they didn't hear, the kind of deliberate non-acknowledgement that felt like its own cruelty. A resident from the night shift turned to a colleague and shook his head like they'd just watched something inevitable play out the way everyone knew it would. Rachel stood in her scrubs, the early morning cold making her breath visible. She took one measured breath. Perfectly controlled. Perfectly aware of every watching face, every calculating eye. One tear escaped. Just one. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, maintaining the same calm that had carried her through worse than this, through the moment an IED detonated 20 meters from her position in Fallujah, through writing casualty notification letters, through learning her husband's name had been added to the memorial wall. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the parking lot quiet, everyone heard it. The chain of command works both ways, Doctor. Eventually. She turned and walked toward the service entrance, her shoulders perfectly level, her stride perfectly even. Behind her, she heard Dr. Gabriel's smile falter. Dr. Washington exchanged a glance with another attending, a glance that meant she'd noted the interaction, that she was keeping mental file of this escalation in real time. Rachel pushed through the service entrance and into the basement corridor where the surgical supplies lived and the fluorescent lights buzzed like they were dying. She had 16 minutes before her bedpan shift officially started. 16 minutes before she pushed a cart through the ER and collected plastic containers full of human dignity from patients who'd lost control of their own bodies. But something else had happened while she was in the parking lot absorbing humiliation. Her phone buzzed. She pulled it from her scrub pocket and saw the board update notification from the hospital system. 2 new patient admissions. One was a familiar name from her own medical history who'd been in and out of St. Michael's 4 times in the past 2 weeks. The other was Marine Lance Corporal Jake Martinez, admitted to trauma with acute injuries. Crush syndrome, the alert said. Incoming by medevac. Rachel's breath stopped. Jake Martinez was her replacement. The medic who took her position with the 1st Battalion after she was medically discharged from the Navy with shrapnel embedded in her ribs and a psychological wound that had no name because nobody wanted to admit that watching your husband's last movement had broken something that didn't show up on imaging. Jake was the 23-year-old who'd cried when she told him the unit was his now, who'd written her letters from Camp Lejeune, who'd been in Fallujah for the past 11 months doing the exact work she should have been doing. He'd been hurt. Her unit's medic. Coming to her hospital. Rachel pressed her hand against her ribs, feeling the ridge of scar tissue beneath the scrubs, feeling the dog tag beneath her shirt, the one that came home while her husband didn't, the one that now lived against her heart like a second heartbeat made of steel. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She instead walked down the corridor toward the ER, understanding with perfect clarity that the worst thing Dr. Gabriel could have done was put her on bedpan duty on the exact shift when the universe decided to test whether Captain Rachel Torres had any mercy left in her at all. The radio crackled at 11:47 p.m. Medevac incoming. Male, 26, traumatic leg injury sustained during training evolution. ETA 12 minutes. Fallujah Medical Staging Area reports significant hemorrhage and soft tissue trauma. Level 1 activation. Rachel was in the parking lot. Bedpans. 7 of them, lined in a plastic carrier that smelled like bleach and human failure. Dr. Gabriel's punishment had a specific geometry, visible from every window, audible from every hallway. The temp nurse pushing hospital waste. That was the narrative he'd constructed, and she was playing her role with the precision of someone who understood that composure was its own form of resistance. But the radio call stopped her mid-stride. Fallujah. Not a place. A wound that didn't close. The unit designation followed: 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, the unit that replaced her after her medical discharge. The unit doing the job she couldn't do anymore. The job her husband had died doing. She set the bedpan carrier down on the asphalt. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Everything about her was steady except the thing inside her chest that suddenly felt like shrapnel. 12 minutes. She had 12 minutes to process the fact that the universe had decided to test her on the exact shift Dr. Gabriel had assigned her to bedpan duty in the parking lot. The medevac landed on the hospital roof at 11:59 p.m. Rachel remained outside, watching the rotor wash shake the palms at the perimeter, dust rising in the red glow of the landing lights. She could hear the rotors whop whop whop, the distinctive sound of a UH-60M Blackhawk's main rotor, and muscle memory took over before her conscious mind could stop it. She'd known that sound. She'd lived beneath those rotors. She'd held dying soldiers while those rotors carried them toward hospitals that couldn't save them. The trauma team mobilized inside. Rachel could track it by movement through the windows, rapid deployment, stretcher positioning, ER doors swinging open at velocity. She finished gathering the bedpans. The protocol was clear: bedpan duty meant the parking lot. Bedpan duty meant invisibility. But the universe, apparently, had a sense of timing. She pushed the carrier back through the service entrance at 12:14 a.m. The ER was controlled chaos, trauma bay lights bright enough to bleach everything, monitors announcing themselves in machine staccato, the textured snap of latex gloves being deployed across 7 stations simultaneously. The trauma patient was already on the central table, legs elevated, for lines going into both antecubital fossae, a level 1 rapid infuser running warmed blood products at emergency volume. And then Rachel saw his face. Petty Officer First Class Jake Martinez. 26 years old. The combat medic who had taken her position in 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines after her discharge. The medic who had written her once a letter that said only, "Captain Torres, we're carrying your job now. We won't drop it." He'd been carrying it in Fallujah when something went wrong during a training evolution. An IED. Not a combat scenario. Training. The cruelest possible joke. Rachel stood in the doorway, unmoving, while Jake's eyes moved across the room in the diffuse way of someone in profound shock, and he didn't see her. Why would he? She was the temp nurse. The invisible one. The one pushing bedpans in the parking lot. Dr. Gabriel was directing Jake's care with the efficiency of someone protecting his institutional authority. Vitals read off in rapid sequence. BP 78/52, dropping. Heart rate 156. Respiratory rate 28. GCS 14, alert and oriented but confused. A physician Rachel didn't recognize was assessing the leg injury, a tourniquet already applied above the knee, blood-soaked bandaging, the kind of wound that demanded immediate attention. Significant soft tissue trauma. Possible vascular compromise. Orthopedic consult stat, and we need vascular here now. Rachel felt the weight of every choice that had led her away from the uniform. The shrapnel in Fallujah. The husband who hadn't come home. The medical discharge that had felt like a sentence. The civilian clothes that still didn't fit right. The bedpan duty that was supposed to keep her safe from exactly this, from watching someone else carry the job she couldn't carry anymore, from seeing the wound she couldn't treat. She watched Jake's leg. The swelling was visible even from the doorway, a turgid expansion of the calf muscle that was almost certainly compartment syndrome. The pressure building beneath the fascial envelope, cutting off microvascular perfusion, tissue ischemia setting in, the clock running down. 6 hours. Maybe 8 if they were lucky. After that, amputation. Loss of limb. Loss of function. Loss of the career that had defined him the way it had defined her. Rachel, a voice said from behind her. One of the junior nurses, the one whose name Rachel could never quite remember because she was new, because she was temporary, because everyone temporary eventually left. You're not assigned to trauma today. Dr. Gabriel said. I know what he said, Rachel replied, and something in her voice made the junior nurse step back. The voice was still calm, but underneath it was the sound of compartment syndrome ticking. The sound of tissue death. The sound of someone standing in a doorway watching the job she couldn't do anymore being done by someone who might lose his leg before the night was over. Rachel retreated to the break room. Policy was clear. Restricted from patient care meant restricted from patient care. She sat in the institutional beige chair that smelled like 17 years of cold coffee and broken shifts, touching the dog tag beneath her scrubs. His dog tag. Not hers. Never hers. Through the break room window, she could see the partial view of Trauma Bay 2. Jake's left leg. The swelling visible despite the elevation. Increasing. Visibly increasing over the span of 10 minutes while Dr. Gabriel coordinated orthopedic consult and vascular surgery arranged for the following morning. Standard protocol for soft tissue trauma. Completely wrong protocol for compartment syndrome. Rachel's hands moved before her mind consciously authorized the movement. She stood. She walked to the nearest unattended terminal in the nurse's station. Her badge was still active. Her login credentials still functioned. The system flagged her access, unauthorized outside her assignment parameters, but Rachel knew the administrative protocols well enough now. She navigated to Jake Martinez's chart using the patient identifier from his wristband, the one she'd glimpsed during the trauma team's initial assessment. The chart opened. Vitals history, imaging reports pending, surgical consult notes building in real time. And there, at the bottom, were Dr. Gabriel's standing orders for the trauma protocol. Orders that gave him authority to approve lab work for the incoming trauma patients. Orders that Rachel, as a credentialed nurse, could theoretically execute under physician authorization. Theoretically. She ordered a comprehensive metabolic panel and a creatine kinase panel with an expedited flag. The CK levels would show muscle breakdown. The metabolic panel would show the acid-base disturbance that came from dying tissue. The results would arrive in 90 minutes if the lab moved fast. The results would show compartment syndrome with certainty. She was documenting the orders under Dr. Gabriel's standing authorization when his voice arrived from behind her like a scalpel. You are on bedpan duty. Not a question. A statement of institutional fact. Step away from the terminal. Rachel stepped back, hands visible, the composed deportment of someone who understood that this moment was the precise calibration point between everything she'd hidden and everything Dr. Gabriel was about to expose. He looked at the screen. His face moved through surprise into something darker. Something that looked like recognition. You accessed this patient's chart without authorization. You ordered laboratory work. You falsified standing orders. He was quiet. Controlled. But the control was a thin crust over something hotter. Pack your belongings. End of shift, you're terminated. Hospital policy for scope of practice violations. I'm documenting this as insubordination, unauthorized medical orders, and falsification of physician credentials. Rachel stood in the ER hallway while the world performed its necessary functions around her. Monitors beeped. For pumps hummed. Shoes clicked on polished tile. The fluorescent lights buzzed in their constant, helpless way. Behind her, through the window of Trauma Bay 2, Jake Martinez's leg continued to swell. His CK will be elevated, Rachel said quietly. The metabolic panel will show metabolic acidosis. Compartment syndrome. He has 6 hours before the tissue dies. You don't have authority to diagnose. You don't have authority to treat. And frankly, Captain, he paused. He'd almost said the rank. Almost revealed something. You don't have authority to practice medicine without a license. The termination is effective now. Sit in the break room until the end of your shift. You're restricted from all patient contact. She sat in the break room. The institutional beige chair. The cold coffee smell. The dog tag beneath her scrubs, solid against her collarbone, a reminder that some weight never gets lighter, it just gets reorganized around your skeleton until you forget what lightness feels like. Through the window, Jake's leg continued to swell. The laboratory flagged her orders as unusual but processed them anyway. Standard protocol. 90-minute turnaround. She watched the clock move. 12:47 a.m. 1:15 a.m. 1:44 a.m. The results would arrive at approximately 2:44 a.m. By then, Jake would be 8 hours into the cascade. Tissue ischemia accelerating. Rhabdomyolysis. Acute kidney injury pending. The kind of physiological damage that even vascular surgery couldn't fully reverse once it became systemic. At 2:07 a.m., the lab results flagged in the system. Creatine kinase elevated to 2,847 IU per liter. Potassium at 6.4 millimoles per liter. Bicarbonate at 18. Metabolic acidosis consistent with muscle breakdown and tissue death. Rachel saw Dr. Gabriel receive the alert. She watched from the break room window as he looked at the results, then looked at Jake's leg, then looked at the results again. She watched him process the recognition that he'd made an error. That the temp nurse on bedpan duty had been right. That the patient in Trauma Bay 2 was entering acute renal failure in real time, and the only treatment that could stop it was emergency fasciotomy, incision through the skin and fascia to relieve the compartmental pressure before the tissue cascade became irreversible. He moved fast then. Called vascular. Called orthopedic. Called operating room and didn't care who he had to wake up. The clinical machine accelerated. Jake was prepped. The gurney moved toward OR at 2:31 a.m., and Rachel watched the temp nurse uniform she was wearing become a costume so small, so invisible, that even watching a patient she could have saved 2 hours earlier didn't matter anymore. She touched the dog tag beneath her scrubs and realized that Dr. Gabriel had his answer. He'd found what had been missing from his understanding of who she was. She'd revealed it to him not through any dramatic declaration, but through the one thing she couldn't hide, the competence to know what compartment syndrome looked like before it killed someone. The next voice Rachel heard was Dr. Gabriel's, calling her name across the ER. Not Rachel the temp. Her name. And the tone of his voice carried something that hadn't been there before. Not respect. Respect would come later, if it came at all. Right now it was just recognition that he'd been wrong about who was standing in his hospital, and he had no idea how wrong. The swelling started at 11:47 p.m. Jake's leg turned tight. Shiny. The skin stretched like it might split open at any moment. Rachel watched from the corner of the trauma bay, her hands gripping the edge of the crash cart so hard her knuckles went white. Dr. Gabriel had ordered conservative treatment an hour ago: elevation, ice, compression, observation. Muscle strain, he declared. Soft tissue contusion. Nothing that wouldn't resolve with time and patience. The 10 doctors who had passed through Jake's room since then had agreed. None of them had questioned the diagnosis. None of them had felt the compartment. The thing about compartment syndrome was that it didn't announce itself with fanfare or obvious crisis. It whispered. It progressed. It ate tissue cell by cell while everyone around the patient told themselves there was time. There was always time. Until there wasn't. Rachel had seen it before. Not in civilian hospitals. In Fallujah, in the forward operating base at Al-Habanya, in the dust and blood and chaos of a place where diagnosis came fast or not at all. She'd seen medics miss it. She'd seen it miss muscles and nerves and limbs. She knew the progression like she knew her own heartbeat. 12 to 24 hours from onset to irreversible tissue death. Jake was maybe halfway through. The clock was moving. She could step back. Clock out. Let the system do what systems did, methodical, cautious, protected by protocols and liability waivers and the institutional knowledge that lawsuits moved slower than tissue death. She could tell herself she'd done her job. She could tell herself that ordering the labs had been enough, that she'd given them the information they needed, that what happened next wasn't her responsibility. The thing about being a combat medic was that responsibility didn't work that way. It didn't stop when you took off the uniform. It didn't pause because you were a temp nurse in a civilian hospital trying to disappear into the background. It didn't care about protocols or chain of command or the difference between practicing medicine and recognizing when someone was about to lose a limb. Jake's pain had escalated to the point where even the morphine wasn't touching it. His face had gone gray. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, the kind of breathing that meant agony, real agony, the kind that came from tissue hypoxia and nerve compression. At 12:02 a.m., his eyes rolled back. Unconsciousness was a mercy sometimes. Sometimes it was a warning that time had just run out. Rachel pushed off the wall and moved toward the nursing station. Her movements were smooth. Economical. A temp nurse just making her rounds, checking on a patient, nothing out of the ordinary. She pulled up Jake's chart on the computer. The blood work she'd ordered was still processing, compartment pressures wouldn't show on a standard panel, but elevated CPK and myoglobin would tell the story her eyes already knew. The story no one else seemed to be reading. She grabbed the cordless phone. Dialed the surgical floor. Her voice came out level, professional, with just enough deference to slide under the radar. Dr. Gabriel ordered a fasciotomy consult on the Marine in Trauma Bay 4. Standing order for surgical intervention if compartment syndrome is confirmed. Can we get someone down here? The surgical resident on the other end said they were backed up. 2 emergency cases already in the OR. Earliest they could get down was another 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Rachel did the math in her head. Jake's leg had been swelling for 90 minutes. Compartment pressures would have been climbing for at least 2 hours by Dr. Gabriel's arrival. Tissue death accelerated after 4 hours. Sometimes faster in young, athletic people whose muscle mass was dense and vascular. Jake had been a Marine. Lean muscle. Good circulation. Which meant fast progression. He didn't have 40 minutes. She hung up the phone and stood still for exactly 3 seconds. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant, electric song. The monitor beside Jake's bed beeped its steady rhythm. Somewhere down the hall, someone was crying. Another trauma. Another family in the waiting room understanding that the night had turned into something different than what they'd expected when they got the phone call. Rachel moved to the supply room. Her hands didn't shake. They moved with the precision of someone who had done this before, who had reached for instruments in worse circumstances than a Raleigh emergency room. She found the surgical tray. Found the 10-blade scalpel, sterile in its sealed package. The blade caught the light as she turned it over. She'd never performed a fasciotomy in a hallway. She'd performed them in dust storms with bomb fragments falling around her head. She'd performed them on soldiers whose legs were trapped under burning debris. She performed them with her hand steady and her mind perfectly clear on the singular, burning priority that separated the living from the dead, time. At 12:19 a.m., she pushed the crash cart into Jake's room and locked the wheels. He was still unconscious, his leg now a grotesque swelling of purple and white. The skin was paper-thin in places. She'd seen it before, that was how you knew you were approaching the edge. That was when tissue started dying from the inside out and the skin turned translucent as it prepared to rupture. Rachel didn't call for backup. She didn't page Dr. Gabriel. She didn't wait for authorization or clearance or the kind of institutional blessing that moved the speed of bureaucracy. She opened the sterile package. The blade caught the light one more time. Then she moved. The scalpel cut through skin like it was meant for this. Like her hands had been waiting 2 years to remember what they knew how to do. The first incision ran from just below the knee to above the ankle, following the fascia line. Blood and fluid poured out, dark, desperate, the pressure releasing like breath finally allowed. Jake's body convulsed. His eyes snapped open. "I've got you," Rachel said. Her voice had dropped an octave. "You're going to feel better in about 10 seconds. She made the second incision perpendicular to the first, releasing the fascial compartment fully. The pressure differential was immediate. Audible. The hiss of air and fluid, the sound of pressure meeting vacuum. She could see color already returning to the tissue. Could see the darkness lifting like someone had turned on a light inside his leg. Jake gasped. Then gasped again. His hand reached out and gripped her scrub jacket. "What?" His voice came out ragged. "What did you do?" "Saved your leg." Rachel kept her hand steady. The tissue was already looking better. Oxygen returning. Circulation restoring itself. "Don't move. Just breathe." The ER floor erupted into motion around them. Code Blue had never been paged, but nurses moved anyway, drawn by the commotion, by the sight of an open surgical incision in the middle of the hallway, by the moment when everything they'd been trained to do suddenly inverted. Rachel stepped back from the crash cart as orderlies arrived. Her scrubs were stained red. Her hands were steady. She didn't look at any of them. Dr. Gabriel appeared at the far end of the hallway at 12:24 a.m. He took in the scene, Jake's leg, the incision, Rachel backing away, and his face transformed. Not into anger. Not into outrage. Into triumph. "You just ended your career," he said quietly. Not to Rachel. To himself. To the universe. To the moment he'd been waiting for. Security arrived at 12:31 a.m. They escorted Rachel to administration while Jake was rushed to surgery. The trauma surgeons who examined him in the OR confirmed what Rachel already knew, the fasciotomy had saved his leg. Another 10 minutes and the muscle tissue would have been dead. Another 20 and they would have had to amputate below the knee. She sat in the administrative office while Dr. Gabriel built his case. He had shift reports dating back 3 weeks. He'd highlighted every moment she'd moved with too much confidence. Every instance where she'd anticipated orders. Every time she'd spoken with authority instead of deference. He'd documented her every subtle transgression against the hierarchy that protected his position. "She's dangerous," he said to the hospital administrator, to the risk management officer who'd been called in at 1 in the morning. She performed major surgery without training, without authorization, without even informing the attending physician. What if she'd damaged something? What if she'd made it worse? This is practicing medicine without a license. This is insubordination. This is exactly the kind of catastrophic liability that puts hospitals in court. The administrator looked uncomfortable. "The surgical team says the procedure saved the patient's life." "That's not the point," Dr. Gabriel said. And for the first time, Rachel heard the real fear underneath his words. The point is she can't just decide to do these things. If she gets away with this, what happens next time someone decides protocol doesn't matter? What happens when the next person kills someone because they felt like they knew better? Rachel didn't argue. She didn't explain about compartment syndrome or the 4-hour window or the irreversible tissue death that was measured in minutes when you were running out of them. She didn't mention Fallujah or the Marines she'd saved or the one she hadn't. She didn't explain that sometimes protocols were designed for comfortable situations, and sometimes situations weren't comfortable anymore. At 3 a.m., she emptied her locker. The dog tag caught fluorescent light, Belcdr James Torres, her late husband's name etched into the metal. The Navy SEAL who died in the same engagement where Rachel took shrapnel. The man whose dog tag had come home when he didn't. She wrapped the broken chain around her fingers until it cut into her palm. The rain outside the hospital was hammering down like applause. She drove to the cemetery in the dark, her hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles went white. She stood at his grave for a long time. Just stood there in the rain, water running down her face, indistinguishable from tears. "I made it home and I still couldn't save anyone," she whispered. The blood panel results posted at 4:17 a.m. Emma's results and Jake's results, the ones Rachel had ordered, the ones no one else had thought to check. Both positive for acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Early stage. Treatable. Both patients alive only because Rachel had recognized something no one else had seen. Dr. Gabriel never checked the results. He didn't need to. Dr. Gabriel arrived at St. Michael's at 6 a.m. the morning after Rachel performed the fasciotomy, expecting to find the hallway footage erased and her career already dismantled. Instead, he found the hospital administrator waiting in his office with a manila folder and an expression that looked like watching a building collapse in slow motion. The blood panel she ordered, the administrator said, not bothering with a greeting. Both of them. The 8-year-old patient with the viral myocarditis. The Marine with the compartment syndrome. She was right. On both. We verified with 3 cardiologists and 2 orthopedic surgeons. Her clinical judgment saved 2 lives. Dr. Gabriel, I'm looking at diagnostic reports you signed off on that explicitly contradict the treatment decisions you made. Dr. Gabriel's hands remained steady, palms flat on his desk. She violated protocol. Ordered tests without authorization. Performed a surgical intervention she has no license to perform. The fasciotomy was life-saving. Performed by someone with demonstrable expertise. The administrator set the folder down. I've also been asked by hospital administration to review her file in light of these outcomes. What happened next was methodical. Calculated. Dr. Gabriel knew the only way forward was documentation. He spent the next 16 hours building a legal fortress, pulling every shift report Rachel had ever submitted, every patient interaction note, every moment her work could be twisted into violation. He filed incident complaints with Joint Commission language so arcane that even the administrator would need a compliance officer to parse it. Scope of practice. Unauthorized diagnostic ordering. Performing procedures outside her credential matrix. Each complaint was technically defensible, each one a thread in a tapestry designed to bury her under the weight of institutional rules. He knew the hospital was vulnerable. Any lawsuit claiming they had allowed an uncredentialed person to perform surgery would destroy their malpractice insurance rating. Dr. Gabriel wasn't being vindictive anymore. He was being survival-minded. He was protecting the institution. He was protecting himself. That's what the narrative would say. But that wasn't the worst part. While constructing the termination paperwork, Dr. Gabriel accessed the hospital's employee database to pull Rachel's complete file. He needed her education credentials, her licensing information, anything that could be used to reinforce the scope of practice violations. What he found made his breath catch in his throat. A redacted military service record. Declassified sections showing dates, deployments, unit assignments. And honors. Multiple honors. Bronze Star. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. The words were there, partially obscured by heavy black lines, but readable enough to understand that Captain Rachel Torres, not Nurse Torres, not Temp Torres, but Captain, had received commendations that placed her in a category of military personnel he couldn't comprehend. Combat Medical Specialist. 17 documented emergency fasciotomies in field conditions. Procedure rated as expert level under the Army Combat Medic Qualification Standards. Dr. Gabriel's hands began to move automatically, pulling the paper trail. He filed the termination notice the next morning at 7 a.m., before the hospital's legal team could file a counter-motion. Before anyone could cross-reference her military credentials against her civilian scope of practice. Before the administrator could realize that Captain Rachel Torres had performed a procedure she was demonstrably, officially, and extensively trained to perform. He delivered the termination notice to Rachel personally. The ER was quiet, the 6 a.m. shift change rolling through quietly as night nurses passed off to day staff. Dr. Gabriel found her at the medication cart, checking inventory with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. "Your employment here is terminated, effective immediately," he said, his voice level, his bearing clinical. "You performed a surgical procedure without a valid license. You violated multiple Joint Commission protocols. Security will escort you from the building." Rachel didn't look up from the medication cart. She finished recording the item, carefully replaced the pen, and turned to face him. Her eyes were steady. Composed. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "I understand," she said. 7 words. No defense. No explanation. No mention of the combat medical training, the field surgeries, the 17 fasciotomies that had saved limbs and lives in Fallujah and Helmand and Sanjin. She removed her hospital badge and placed it on the cart. She removed her stethoscope and coiled it carefully. Every motion deliberate. Every motion revealing nothing. Dr. Gabriel watched her walk toward the exit with security, expecting to feel satisfied. Instead, he felt the first tremor of something unfamiliar, not guilt, but awareness. The sense that he had won a battle but had no idea what war he was actually in. That night, Rachel stood in the rain at Arlington Cemetery's Raleigh Memorial Garden, her dress uniform hanging in a closet she hadn't opened in 2 years, her body in civilian clothes that felt like a costume. Water ran down her face, but she didn't call it crying. The dead don't get to hear that sound. The dog tag was in her fist, James's tag on a chain that had broken 6 months after he died, the link corroded by salt water and time and the weight of being the only piece of him that came home. She pressed it against her palm until the metal left an impression in her skin. "I made it home and I still couldn't save anyone," she whispered into the rain, and the words dissolved before they could hurt anyone else. She didn't know that the Marine, a Jake Martinez, corpsman first class, call sign breaker, had called his battalion commander the moment Rachel was fired. She didn't know that commander had called his commanding general. She didn't know that a 2-star general from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines was currently standing in the St. Michael's Administrative Conference Room with a folder containing Captain Rachel Torres's complete service record, now declassified. The general walked into the ER at 8 a.m. the next morning, dress blues immaculate, the kind of presence that made air pressure change. He asked for administration and was escorted to the conference room where the hospital board was reviewing Dr. Gabriel's termination case. Jake Martinez was there too, still moving carefully on his restored leg, still in the dress uniform of a Marine in active duty status. "Reaper 6, Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen her pull 3 wounded soldiers through enemy fire. "You're looking for information on Captain Rachel Torres. That's my unit commander's commanding general. He has something to tell you about what happened in that hallway." The general opened the folder. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Captain Torres holds combat medical certifications that exceed civilian credentials. She has performed emergency fasciotomies 17 times in field conditions. The procedure she performed on this Marine would have required amputation without her intervention. She saved his life using expertise earned through 2 tours in Fallujah and 1 tour in Helmand Province." He began reading from the citation, his voice steady and precise. "For extraordinary heroism in the face of enemy action, while serving as senior combat medic with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines." Dr. Gabriel, who had been called back to administration, felt the words hit like rounds. But something had already happened in the IT department. Marcus Chen, hospital systems administrator and former Navy corpsman, had been watching Dr. Gabriel access the security system. Chen had seen him delete the hallway footage of the fasciotomy. Chen had also seen what Dr. Gabriel didn't know, that every deletion to the hospital network was automatically backed up to an external drive, timestamped and logged and utterly unrecoverable by someone without Chen's clearance. More than that, Chen had seen the other files Dr. Gabriel deleted. Shift logs showing Rachel had worked hours she hadn't worked. Performance reviews documenting patient interactions that never happened. Incident reports dated after the supposed incidents. Dr. Gabriel hadn't just been building a case against Rachel. He had been fabricating evidence. Chen made 3 phone calls. Hospital administration. The State Medical Board. A contact at the Inspector General's office. And then he sent the evidence. By the time Dr. Gabriel returned to his office, his access badge was deactivated. Security was waiting with a folder of his own. Criminal falsification of medical records. Destruction of evidence. Attempted obstruction of justice. His license was under review. His employment was terminated. The hospital's legal team was preparing for the possibility of both civil and criminal prosecution. Rachel didn't hear about any of this until the next afternoon, when the hospital administrator called her directly. All termination proceedings have been dropped. We're offering full reinstatement with a formal apology and a settlement for wrongful termination, the administrator said. We'd like you back on the schedule as soon as possible. Rachel listened to the words without interrupting. She thought about the break room. She thought about watching tissue death accelerate in real time. She thought about the rules that had almost cost a Marine his leg. I appreciate the offer, she said, her voice carrying the precision of someone giving orders, not asking permission. I decline. I have another position. What the administrator didn't know was that Jake Martinez had been making calls of his own. Captain Rachel Torres had 5 job offers from VA hospitals across the Southeast, each one specifically requesting a chief of emergency medicine with combat medical experience. The VA understood what St. Michael's had tried to hide, that sometimes the best doctors were the ones who had already saved lives in conditions that would shatter most people. Rachel accepted the position at the VA hospital in Raleigh. 6 months later, she walked through the entrance as chief of emergency medicine, and for the first time since coming home, she wore the dog tag openly. It rested against her scrubs, James's call sign visible to anyone who looked close enough, a reminder that some chains break so others can be saved. Dr. Gabriel was already there, mopping hallway floors as part of his community service sentence. The State Medical Board had suspended his license for 3 years. The hospital had banned him from ever practicing in their network. He needed work and the VA was willing to hire him for minimum wage, the only place that would take him after his lawyer negotiated to keep him out of prison for falsifying medical records. Rachel walked past him every morning. She didn't acknowledge his presence. Didn't change her pace. Didn't alter her expression. He was invisible to her now, the same way he had tried to make her invisible, and that invisibility was punishment enough. One morning, a young nurse, new to the ER, nervous in the way all new nurses are, asked Rachel about the dog tag while they were reviewing charts. Rachel touched it with 2 fingers, the way someone touches a prayer. My husband. LCDR James Torres. He died in Fallujah doing what he believed in. She paused, looking at the chain. This reminds me why I do what I do. Some chains break so others can be saved. The camera pulls back. Rachel leading her team through morning rounds, the ER humming with the quiet efficiency of a place where lives matter more than protocols. Dr. Gabriel in the background, mopping silently, a ghost in his own narrative. Emma, the 8-year-old with viral myocarditis, remains in remission. Her father sends Rachel letters every month. Jake Martinez completed physical therapy and returned to active duty, calls Rachel every month to check on her, to thank her, to remind her that she did save someone after all. Captain Rachel Torres stands at the medication cart, her medication cart now, checking inventory with the same methodical precision she brings to everything. The dog tag rests openly against her scrubs, engraved with LCDR James Torres and the date he died. A reminder. A wound. A purpose. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, leave a comment and tell your story. And please, like and subscribe for more stories about the ones who quietly save us, the heroes who walk among us in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. Click the notification bell so you never miss a new story of courage, redemption, and the quiet power of dignity.